All right, now as promised, we're joined by Bob Duff, author and hockey historian. And Bob, I really appreciate you coming on, especially in light of the Capitals putting a lot of demons to bed and getting themselves the Stanley Cup this last week.
Yeah, and you can certainly see the joy, the unadulterated joy, I guess would be the best description of it, in Alex Ovechkin. I mean, it's funny how people used to talk about how the European players didn't have the same passion for the Stanley Cup that North American players had. But, I mean, he's been like a kid in a candy store since he hasn't let that cup out of his sight since he won it. It's just been, I think it's been great for hockey in general just to watch him celebrate it like a little boy and just to see the gleam in his eyes and the delight he has. And, he's waited 13 years to get to this moment. And, I remember being from the Detroit area when the same thing happened to Steve Yzerman, who waited 14 years to win his cup. And it was funny that a lot of the things people were saying about Ovechkin, that he couldn't win, that he was more about individual than the team. They said that about Yzerman for the first half of his career. Now the narrative on Steve Yzerman is he's one of the greatest leaders who ever played the game. So it's funny how you win a championship and the public's perception of you takes a 180.
Yeah, we talk about Lombardi's, the Super Bowl trophy or the NFL championship trophy and winning a World Series and the NBA titles and go down that list. People forget how old the Stanley Cup is, really, when it comes to looking at that trophy for that specific sport.
Yeah, this was the 125th anniversary of the Stanley Cup. First contested in 1893 when it was exclusively for amateur teams in those days. There was no professionalism at all in hockey, and back then it was just basically people who had ordinary jobs who also happened to play hockey. There was no full-time hockey players in those days, so it's kind of interesting to think of going back into that era where, they were just ordinary folks winning the cup to today where these international superstars. It's just really a hard thing to fathom that, one time the Stanley Cup was just a trophy that literally anyone could win.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned the celebration of the Capitals, and I was immediately reminded of being a sort of child of the 60s and 70s. Soviet, that term, or Russian athletes back then were always referred to as, being robotic or military types and, emotionless players and things like that. And that really came crashing. That kind of perception came crashing down a long time ago. But I was really reminded of watching Ovechkin, whether it was going through the lobby with the Stanley Cup over his head, or doing the keg stands in the Stanley Cup, or the Stanley Cup, his teammates and he in the fountain at the hotel. It was fun to watch, and we don't see enough of that. I don't think that kind of little kid in our professional athletes.
And I think that's one of the beauties of the Stanley Cup is the people's trophy. I mean, it's out there in the public, and every player, as part of the ritual, gets a day with the Stanley Cup during the summer to take it to share it with their friends and family. And usually, most players will do some kind of charity fundraising event or take it to a hospital and show it to sick kids. But there's just an aura about the Stanley Cup that that I don't know that it's there with any other championship trophy. It was funny in 2012 when the Los Angeles Kings won the cup. Kevin Westgarth, who's a good friend of mine, was on that Kings team, and his wife is Bill Cowher's daughter.
Right.
And she'd been in Detroit when the Steelers won the Super Bowl over Seattle, and had seen that celebration. And obviously, you've seen a number of those yourself.
Right.
She just couldn't believe the difference between how she said they basically had the Lombardi trophy there the night they won. The league took it away. They brought it back the next day and did some photo ops with it, but then they really didn't ever see it again. And yet she said since the Kings had won the Stanley Cup, they'd seen it every day.
Yeah, I can tell you from personal experience, before you win one, you don't handle a Super Bowl trophy unless you're wearing like white gloves. Because they come from Tiffany's and all that, and they are, I guess they're platinum, so they're very smudgy. if you handle them with your common people hands. But the chance to actually hold one is extremely rare. And that was one of the first things I thought of personally when I was watching, the clips of Ovechkin and over the years watching these players. Everybody gets to take it for a weekend or so, or a week, because you see guys take it home to their farms and with their friends and their family, and everybody, guys are eating cereal out of the Stanley Cup, the bowl on top. It is fantastic, and it backs up your title there of the People's Trophy.
I remember Kevin told me that he brought the cup home. He brought it to his parents' place, and he said that kind of their morning ritual when he visited his folks, so they'd all sit around the kitchen table and have a coffee together. And he said that day he brought the cup home, he just put the cup in the middle of the kitchen table, and they all sat and had a coffee around the cup. Just kind of added the Stanley Cup to their morning ritual.
That's great. That's great. I was also reminded, preparing for doing this interview with you and looking through some of the amazing books, and the number of books you've written, but the titles and the subject matters of so many of the books. I was reminded of that event 20 years ago when the Red Wings won the Stanley Cup and the limo crash and everything else. I couldn't believe that had been 20 years. And in my memory, I was reminded, that was back when they were in the process of going back to back with Stanley Cups when that happened.
Yeah, and you wonder, without that limousine crash, if Vladimir Konstantinov, who was just in his prime then, if he'd have stayed healthy and played a full career, would they have won more than just those two in a row? Because that was quite a hockey team. And it was such an emotional week. I remember it well because, it had been 42 years since the Red Wings had won the Stanley Cup. So the euphoria of the night that they won it. And then 6 days later, the tragedy of, their not only Konstantina, but also their team masseuse, Sergei Monatsakonov, was also badly injured in the car accident. And, they did everything right. That was the worst part about it. They knew they were going to have a party. They knew they were going to have something to drink. So they hired limos. They didn't drink and drive. They did the right thing, and it still ended in tragedy. It's just such a sad memory.
Oh, yeah, it is something. It really is. Hey, I think you're the perfect person to ask about this because, being a hockey historian, you've obviously been around it and seen it at all levels, whether it's the Pee-wees, the youth, the NHL, whatever level of hockey there is. Is there as big a problem with being active and being proactive about traumatic brain injuries and concussions in hockey on all levels, and as much pushback as you see in football? Especially not so much from the athletes, especially at the highest level, but you see coaches have accepted it more. But are parents as much of a problem when it comes to TBIs and concussions in hockey?
I think they are at the youth level. I know another friend of mine who works with one of the local minor hockey associations. He's a chiropractor who's done extensive research into concussions. He's gone to several U.S. universities and taken courses and learned as much as he could. And he had set up for their entire youth hockey organization baseline testing that, parents could bring the kids in to the rink at the start of the season, and he had all the programs set up there, and they could do all the baseline tests. And then they'd have that if the kid did get a head injury, they could have him do that baseline test again, and they know not to let him play until he was able to do the test as well as he had at the start of the season. And there were parents that just refused to do it. They didn't want their kid, there's such an obsession about, my kid's going to be the next Sidney Crosby or the next Alex Ovechkin, that he's got to be on the ice because this might be the night he gets seen. That, parents are just they drive these kids, I think, beyond the breaking point in some cases. And kids just get burnt out because they're just pushing them so hard. It's almost like their kid's a commodity rather than their child. And, they don't always look out for the best interest of their child. And it is a sad thing. And what was ironic about it all when they did it, one of the people who had her children in that organization was Bob Probert's widow. And Bob, of course, donated his brain after he had passed away, and they did find that he had the head problem. I'm drawing a blank now on the TCE.
CTE, yeah.
CTE, sorry, yeah.
Right.
And so she was adamant that her kids were going to get tested, and she, there's someone who, has experienced it and knows and has seen, how it impacted her husband. And it turned out one of her kids did have a head injury that year and was kept out for quite a while. And she wouldn't let him play until he could pass his baseline tests. And, there's someone that, who knows what it's like to have someone who in the family who's a professional athlete. And yet she was wise enough to know that, you can't take chances with this. And I think you're absolutely right. At the highest level, the NHL is dismissing the evidence as readily as the NFL has. And Gary Bettman was questioned quite a bit about it during his press conference he always holds at the Stanley Cup final, and he just basically dismissed it, suggesting that there's no proof yet. There's nothing for sure. But I mean, you just have to look around at what's going on and with all professional athletes as they get older, and there's definitely something seriously wrong that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. I would. His office is in New York, right?
Correct.
Yeah, I would advise him to head just slightly north to Boston University, and consult with those people there about the impact of repetitive head blows. But I'll be honest. Those of us that have been in these more violent sports, and especially those of us that are involved also in the media, at times can be part of the problem of moving this ball down the field, if you will, only because it's easy to kind of glorify the very things that shouldn't be allowed in the sport. I mean, how many times even during this Stanley Cup Finals did we see almost defenseless guys? And I know it's part of hockey. It's just like it's part of football. But that shot on like Marchessault, that shouldn't be a part of hockey. And there's probably the majority out there who looked at that and went, that's just normal playing. What are you, crazy?
Well, I think in my opinion, there's two things. There was kind of a systemic change in hockey in the mid-90s. Hitting used to be, when I was in my formative years in competition in the late 70s, early 80s, hitting was about separating the player from the puck, and then you take the puck. It was actually a skill that you would skate on an angle into the player, bump him off the puck, and then you would proceed the other direction with the puck. Mm-hmm. And the biggest hits in those days were hip checks, which usually hit between, above the knee and below the waist. We would try to get a guy, but as there were some guys who came into the league in the 90s, and Vladimir Malikov was one of them, Darius Kasparaitis was another, that Brian Marchment, they were hitting lower, and they were starting to take guys out at the knees, and there was a hue and cry about all these knee injuries, and all of a sudden the hits started coming up, and now you're hitting above the waist, and now it's more like football where it's becoming a collision sport now. And hits are not. And how often do you see the hitter takes themselves out of the play too in a collision? It's a collision now. It's not a scientific way to get the puck, which is what it was designed. Body checking was designed, and it's just about punishment. And I think the person doing the hitting is punishing themselves just as much. And as you say, they're hitting defenseless players, which, the old saying used to be in hockey, you get hit when you need to get hit, and you don't hit someone that is in a dangerous position where they could be badly hurt. And, obviously guys skating with the puck with their head down are fair game, but, somebody just along the boards, not really, and running them from behind and putting their head into the glass. I mean, that didn't happen when I played, and now it's pretty commonplace.
Yeah. As a sort of outsider looking in, I follow hockey intermittently through the year, and I'm one of those guys that kind of gets interested once the finals come around, or even maybe the conference finals. But I was really surprised kind of watching it, and I think over the last couple of years, hearing more mentions made of during a game, for instance, being the second period, and a commentator saying, that's his 23rd hit so far. It just kind of jumped out at me. I said, wow, when did they start keeping track of that? When did that become become like a stat?
Yeah, in the last 10 years or so, they've started to keep track of hits, and it's kind of a questionable stat too, because it's not like a tackle where in a football game a tackle had a significant impact on the game because it stopped the play, but a hit can be an innocuous play that had no bearing on what was going on the ice, and yet they say, well, this guy's got 273 hits. Yeah, but how many of them mattered?
Mm-hmm.
How many of them had an impact on the outcome of the game? So it's kind of a misleading stat. I think I don't know really what it's supposed to prove other than that the guy runs into people a lot.
How can fans, how can people around our games, whether it's hockey or football, do more about sort of, keeping or pressing people's feet to the fire that are in charge of sort of being more aware? Is it just making sure the subject stays out there? Is it as simple as that?
Well, to me, the tragic part is I don't know how many people really care. It's just unfortunate until it's, it hits home with them and it's someone in their family and they're in their circle of friends that it has the injury. I mean, I knew someone that was completely non-sports related, but a good friend of mine slipped on the ice and hit her head on the cement, and her life was messed up for a good year just from that concussion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not even sports related, so until it really impacts your own life, I don't think you can recognize. And even to me, to see what she went through, that really opened my eyes a lot. And I'm someone that's in sports. I mean, I don't get to see these athletes. I don't know if you saw the story that Johan Franzen, one of the Red Wings whose career was ended by multiple concussions, she wrote a story she keeps a blog, and she posted it a couple of weeks ago just talking about all the horrible, horrible things he's had to go through, and the
mm-hmm.
depression and the anger and all that. And it just really, really lets you know. That's the people I think that as the media we should be talking to more, is the families of the players, because they see it every day. They see the worst of the worst and how this really impacts and changes them as people and that. And I don't think, we just see them at the stadium or at the rink, and usually it's when they're feeling better. So you don't really get a good grasp of how much this impacted them. And I remember talking to Pat LaFontaine, a hockey player whose career was ended by concussions. I talked to his brother at one point, and he said Pat was so bad at one point he couldn't tie his own shoes. DJ Smith, who is an assistant coach at the Leafs now, his career was ended by concussions, and he told me at his worst, the only way he could get relief, he would go sit in a dark closet and just sit on the floor in the quiet, in the dark, and that was the only way to get away from the pain. We don't see that, and that's the stuff that needs to be out there. But I think the problem, and I think it's similar to with the steroids problem in baseball, people want to see the long home runs, and there's fans that are willing to make that trade-off. They don't care if the guy's on steroids, if he's going to hit 500-foot home runs and hit 60 home runs in a year. And I think people want to see the punishing hits in hockey and football, and I think a lot of us just don't want to acknowledge the damage that's being done, and they just it's. And I think the big challenge is getting the public to care and say that this is really dangerous and this is going to really harm these guys. And it's still a great game when guys aren't getting knocked out cold. I don't know why why is violence, like I've often said with hockey, in the era where Wayne Gretzky played, the most creative player who's probably ever skated on ice, the person who became the voice of hockey was Don Cherry, who was all about physical punishment and hitting and fighting. And we've raised a generation now of people who grew up watching him basically promote violence, and yet had the greatest skill player ever to play the game in the same era. And people don't talk about him as much as they talk about what Don Cherry does. Like, it's just has always baffled me that, a guy like Gretzky, I mean, like ignoring a Barry Sanders or a Walter Payton.
Oh, yeah.
Don't, it's just, when you see someone who transcends the game and does things that really very few have ever done or will ever do, it's something you should admire and, cherish.
I agree 1,000%, Bob. I mean, it's crazy how it does work that way. Hey, my last question is something that, this season, it started as a unique item, kind of became a mini phenomenon, and then just went full-fledged bonkers. And that's the whole energy and experience around the Las Vegas Knights. How good is that for the hockey world and for the NHL to have a team do something like that, go to the Stanley Cup Finals in their first year of existence, the whole flash and bang and pizzazz around it? I mean, we've seen the Sunshine States, kind of get integrated into the hockey world. And some of them do very well, and some of them, like the franchise here in Atlanta, kind of just fade away. But how good is it for hockey in general and the future health of the sport to have the story like the Vegas Knights?
Well, everybody loves an underdog, and I think that was set up. And I don't think anyone thought it would be this successful. But the way they set up the expansion draft for Vegas, there was going to be a chance to succeed more quickly than a traditional expansion team because, by only allowing teams to protect 11 players, every team had to expose more than half of their roster to Vegas. So the way I saw it explained pretty succinctly was, they didn't get an Ovechkin or a Crosby. So their first line isn't as good as the other team's first line. But basically every player they drafted was either a second line player or a second pairing defenseman. So their second line is going to be as good as your team's second line. And their third and fourth lines are probably better because those aren't fourth line players. Those are guys that were playing on the second line on their previous team. So their depth was a big factor in how they were able to do what they did. They didn't get a lot of injuries either, which was another factor. Mm-hmm. And because there were no expectations, Gerard Gallant, the coach, was able to just keep throwing guys out there when they made mistakes and let them learn from their mistakes. There wasn't the pressure because no one expected them to win the division or make the playoffs. So he was able to kind of just let them play and grow as a team together and really bond together. And I think there always is that bond with any expansion team because they always feel like they've been rejected and they feel like they're misfits and like nobody wants them. And this is their chance to show that, you should have kept me. So I think there was an element of that as well. But it's going to be interesting to see how it transpires long term though, because now they built to win this year, but they don't have the resources that a team that's been around 10, 20 years. It has a deep farm system that's been drafting players for a decade, so they don't have the organizational depth that other teams do, and it'll be interesting to see going forward. They traded a lot of draft picks to get players to try to win the cup, and in the long run that might be something that could impact them negatively.
All right. Hey, Bob, thank you so much for joining me. Really, really appreciate it. And good luck to you.
Okay. Thanks, Randy. It was my pleasure.
All right.